So glad you could join us this evening for our third Thursday talk here in June. I am Penny Imeson, and I am the director here at Rocktown History, where things are happening all the time. It gets really exciting, a little hectic, but lots and lots of fun. And so I'm going to quickly go over a few items that are coming up. On Tuesday, our coffee mill is going to be having lunch. So if you plan to come to the coffee mill, come at noon and plan to bring an heirloom dish if you would like to join in the potluck. And it can be something that's come down through your family, or just something that you like, or something that's easy. But we hope that a nice group will come and join us. The heirloom coffee mills, where they just talk about their heirloom recipes, have really been a fan favorite. So they decided to embrace the idea of the America's potluck this year for the 250th, and they're going to have lunch on Tuesday. And then you probably have a flyer in a seat nearby for our heirloom markets. They are kicking off on Thursday evening, June 25th. They will be from 5 to 8, and there's 40 or 50 vendors signed up to be at Fort Harrison, Rocktown History, and the Virginia Quilt Museum at Silver Lake Mill. So the historic sites will be open. The vendors will be happy to talk to you. This is not your normal farmers market or craft fair. This is really something special that we hope the community will embrace. It is referencing tradition. So people who grow, people who use traditional methods to create. It's just a wide variety, and I hope everybody will come out for the fourth Thursdays this summer. And I'm looking around, and I see a couple of faces that might be new, and some members who are here, and volunteers. I just want to say thank you to everybody who is here. If you happen to not be a member, there is a membership form on some of those chairs, hint, hint. So we would love to have your support for that. And obviously donations are always welcome. Our beautiful little jar is out in the hallway. And for those people online, thank you for joining us. The donation button is always ready for you also online. So this evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Evan Knappenberger. Evan is a doctoral student at Drew University, Madison, New Jersey, and a former U.S. Army intelligence analyst writing in history, philosophy, and theology. He holds an MA in religion from Eastern Mennonite Seminary, a BA in philosophy and theology from Eastern Mennonite University, and an AAS from Whatcom Community College. As a historian and analyst, Evan seeks out the forgotten and overlooked. His trademark research uncovers unique details and little-known commentary of the times. And actually, I'm going to take a mission moment, if you don't mind. I was thinking about this driving into work this morning, about the people like Evan and Dale McAllister and Pat Ritchie and so many others, the volunteers who have been here for decades, the people who save the stories that are at the core of our community. And I just might get a little emotional about this because, for one thing, it's just amazing the work that people do and how generous they are with it. But really, our family history, our genealogies can be lost within 3 generations. And frankly, our community histories, the education, the industry, the farming, the religion, the social, everything that has gone on in the past can fade away. And so tonight we're going to hear a story that I don't know if you should do a poll and see if anybody's heard your story before. But it's the people who do this work give us the opportunity to look back and understand and learn from the past. And you know, that's our mission, and we're so excited when we can share and help our friends and neighbors be educated. All right, so back to Evan. I'm glad to introduce you so that we can hear about the Rockingham roots of America's anti-slavery movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny.
You're using
I've
this
got
just-
It is a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all. I know there's a number of people online from Drew. Hello, classmates and professors. So this project started as an independent study last year, and I ended up working for about 8 months on it total. And this is my manuscript. What I'm going to be sharing tonight is essentially one chapter with some other things thrown in of a 10-chapter book that I wrote, which is still being shopped around for publication. So who here has heard of George Bourne? Okay, one or two people. Okay. Who here heard of George Bourne before I told you about George Bourne? Okay, very few people. I had no idea. In fact, when I first saw the name Bourne, it was in a printing context. I was working on printing history in early Harrisonburg, and I had no idea who he was. It was just another name. But it turns out this guy is very important. Oops, turn that on. These are some of the things I'm not going to cover. I just wanted to mention really quickly. These are some of the 10 chapters that I wrote. The work that I did uncovered the Underground Railroad activity in Rockingham County. There's not much documentation on that in American history. To find new things on that is really big. And I did, in fact, find a few very interesting things. I also found, for example, a lynching in Port Republic of a white man in the 1850s who was, they called it Negro tampering, was the actual crime. It was a state crime. I think it meant talking to black people without the permission of the master. Some of the best stuff, Henry and William Ruffner, in my opinion, I'm not going to cover any of that. But there are a couple of key arguments. One is the language of enslavement. There's a lot of debate still about this, different terms that get thrown around. I come down firmly on the side of David Bryan Davis, who's a very important historian of the late 20th century, who is in favor of using the historically accurate terminology. It doesn't mean I endorse that. In Rocktown history, certainly does not. There is a very ongoing deep debate about the presence and nature of slavery in Western Virginia. Everybody can kind of agree that the Tidewater and the Piedmont had some serious slavery going on, but there is a lot of debate about what it was like, how many slaves were there, was it a different type of slavery, what was the quality of slavery in this area as opposed to the Eastern Shore. And along with that, we have this very morally nuanced idea of anti-slavery. The three characters that I'm going to introduce you to, they all consider themselves to be anti-slavery, and yet they all were at each other's throats, and slavery just divided them so terribly. Yet they all would have been anti-slavery. Oh, this picture, by the way, is a famous picture from, gosh, I can't remember the year on it now. We'll say it's like 1790s. There's very precious little graphic representation of slavery from the time period. But this is a group of slaves going to Tennessee. Just a little background. Slave resistance has always been a thing. As long as there's been slavery, there's been resistance among slaves. And that really started here in the first years of the colony here. Slaves would run away to join the Indians or found their own little communities. The first slave community of runaways or freed slaves in the valley was 1727 near Lexington. And that's documented. There's always been a conscientious religious scruple among the Quakers that dates back to the early days of Quakerism, and it gets formalized at Germantown in the Germantown Quaker Meeting House by a group of mixed German Mennonites and English Quakers. And the guy's name was Pastorius, who formalizes this in a document. And this is thanks to Andrew Fairfield that I know this. Quakers in the valley, there were quite a few. In fact, this has really surprised me because you always read and you hear about the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the German Anabaptists, these people groups that we're familiar with that are still here. You don't necessarily hear about the Quakers. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the families that settled this area and west of here were Quakers. And I could just throw out a few names: the Bryan family, the Boones, Daniel Boone. In Hardy County, you have the Claypools. They were all Quakers. At one point before the 1780s, there were something like 50 different meetings in the Shenandoah Valley, congregations. They struggled mightily with the issue of slavery from a very early time period. We have Quaker travelogues from these men, John Woolman, John Churchman, Hugh Judge. I think there's 2 or 3 dozen travelogues of Quakers that would regularly come through here, and they were very concerned about slavery. I wrote a whole chapter on that. I wish I could tell you a lot more. The Methodists, we're familiar with the Methodist split of the 1840s. They divided over slavery. I think that finalized in 1845. But John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was very much against slavery from a very early time, dating back to like the 1770s. And in fact, he makes fun of the Yankees as they're pressing for their own political freedom. He says, you want your freedom, but you have these slaves that they don't have their freedom. This gets carried on by Francis Asbury, who founded the Methodist Church of America, basically in Harrisonburg in the 1790s. And the first Methodist conference in America was in Harrisonburg, in a little log house on Jail Hill, which is now more or less where Community Mennonite House is. There's a lot of good documentation there. We had these guys called the Croakers. They were these Methodist itinerant preachers, and I think they were called Croakers because they would yell about these things until they got hoarse. They were kind of made this croaking sound. Steve Longenecker at Bridgewater College has covered those pretty well. Another cool thing that I found that nobody knew about is a guy named Father John Hershey. He was here in the 1830s. He was one of these itinerant Methodist preachers. He was ordained, and he would travel all over Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee on foot. He was so conscientious about slavery, he wouldn't eat sugar because sugar was refined by slave labor. And John Hersey goes to found the African Methodist Church out of Harrisonburg in the 1830s. Along with 3 other ordained Methodists, he goes to Liberia, and the other 3 all died within a year of different diseases. And Father Hersey continued that project. Is the beginning of African Methodism, and he had a root right here in Harrisonburg. 2 really interesting things. Gosh, I wish I could tell you all about this stuff. I just have to gloss over it. During the French and Indian War, and then again during the Revolution War, we have, I want to call it blowback against these people of conscience. So for example, George Washington takes a bunch of Quakers and Mennonites from Philadelphia who are suspected of being loyalists. Probably they were just nonviolent pacifists. And he marches them on foot from Philadelphia to Winchester, puts them in the jail in Winchester, and imprisons them there for the better part of a year. And if you read their diaries, they say things like, "This ordeal made us more aware of the plight of the slaves." And this made us want to be better abolitionists. They didn't have the word abolition yet, though. The Gabe Prosser Rebellion, revolt. Has anybody heard of that? A couple people have. In 1800, there was an enslaved blacksmith in Richmond named Gabe Prosser. He starts this revolt. It failed probably because of the weather. It might have succeeded. Who knows what would have happened. They were going to kill all of the white people that they came in contact with, except for Methodists and Quakers and Frenchmen, because those are the people who are friendly to them and had been. When this gets out, of course, the rebellion fails. I think the state executed somewhere like 60 or 70 enslaved men. They tortured them first and then got confessions out of them. This was so scary to white people in Virginia that it caused a huge sensation. The Commonwealth started passing laws against Quakers. They were not explicit in the laws, but if you read the debates about the laws in the legislature, they actually named the Quakers. So they start passing these things, one of which was the 1804 Militia Omnibus, where they reworked the entire military system, which at that time had been focused on the Native Americans to the west, who are the main threat. And now we have to focus on the slaves, who are now the main threat. One of the things that militia overhaul did was it ended specific exemptions for Quakers. So you have this mass exodus. There's several books have been written about this. They called it Ohio Fever. So between 1800 and 1810, like I said, there were several dozen meeting houses in the valley. They all got up and left, some of them as meetings. Family groups would get up and go to Ohio. So that by 1810, 1812, there's very few Quakers left in Virginia. And these are some cool Quaker things that today a workshop. This is the first Quaker meeting house in Newmarket. And then you have the one in 10th Legion, which is, I think, the second iteration of that building. And then this is kind of the mother church building in Hopewell, that's near Winchester. These were all bastions of anti-slavery sentiment. There were chapters of slave improvement societies. There were letter writing campaigns. There were legal aid societies for people who are wrongly enslaved, all of which the state legislature passed specific laws to put down. Okay, so now that's the background. We can finally talk about our three characters. There's two Georges and a Conrad. This is our first George. I want to show you this picture first. So everybody know where the Lincoln House is? Anybody? Some people do. The Lincolns were another family of Quaker origin, by the way. The Lincoln House is just down the road here. This is Old 42. If you can imagine that, it was a 6-foot wide dirt road. Just down the road from the Lincoln House, this house is still here, is the Baxter House, right here. George Baxter grew up there. He was born 1771. The story is that as a little boy, he was climbing in a tree in the yard, and he fell out and broke his leg. It never healed right. He had to give up his dreams of being a cowboy and a hero and become a lowly academic. He kind of had this chip on his shoulder the rest of his life, too. He was educated along with Conrad Speece at Hampton, Sydney. And one of his teachers was this Reverend David Rice, who's considered the anti-slavery apostle of Kentucky. He also is the one who moved Liberty Hall into being Washington Academy. And then it, of course, became Washington Lee University is how we now know it. And then he worked at Hampton Sydney as, I think he was the president there for a while. He was considered to be one of the big guns of the Presbyterian world of his day. He did author this 1838 apologetics that we're going to look at. He was against slavery. We'll see all of that. I'll come back to him. I don't have a picture of Conrad. He was buried at Fort Defiance. Chris and I and Andrea found his grave. It's a great little cemetery if you ever get to go to the old cemetery at Augusta Stone Church. Conrad was ordained by George Bourne, and he also wrote the position statement in 1819 for the Presbyterian Church against slavery. He was a key advocate of the ACS, which is the American Colonization Society, which was the group that was sending black people to Liberia. Of humble origin, he was raised by the smiles of the Lord to stand in the valley. You can see George Baxter's there again. These are some of his accomplishments. With Dr. Baxter, he laid down in the assembly, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. In the case of Daniel Bourne, his neighbor, the platform of the Southern churches on slavery. So I thought that was important to include in here. By 1856, which is about 40 years after the fact, they've already misremembered Bourne's name. They can't even get his name right. We'll come back to that again too. But you can get the sense of these guys, beloved by his brethren in the ministry and feared by some others, and they don't name who those people are. But George Bourne, of course, is the most important of our characters here. George was born in England. He was educated in a seminary in London. He came to Baltimore in 1805. He worked as a newspaperman for about two and a half years. And then he moved to Rockingham County, where he taught as a subscription teacher. And then finally, he ended up in Augusta County, north of Stanton. And my assumption is that it was at the Augusta Old Stone Church, which Chris and Andrea and I found the foundations of out in the field near that cemetery where Conrad is buried. He taught there for about 2 years, 2 seasons, and then he starts full-time ministry work in Port Republic. He helps build the Port Republic Presbyterian Church along with a guy named Samuel Lynn. And then he decides he can't give up his newspaper and his printing press. This is more than just a hobby to him. He loves it so much. So he partners up with a guy named Andrew Baker Davidson, and they buy a newspaper press and a book press, and they operate it out of Harrisonburg, which, by the way, was in 1810 was about 15 buildings. So, I mean, right there on Court Square. One of the problems, and this is a key moment, not just in Rockingham County history, but in American history. So in 1811, they start this press. One of the problems in the press is labor, right? There's just not enough labor. This is a very constant problem in the early republic. So they're using slave labor. One of the slaves that is employed in this press is Andrew Baker Davidson, his business partner, has a slave named Uncle Joe. And Joe has been promised his freedom. It's not clear really from the letters why. We have letters between Bourne and his business partner, and they're a treasure of local history. But there's some things that still aren't clear. But Joe is promised his freedom, possibly because of Bourne's influence on Davidson. And the time for his hoped for emancipation comes and goes. And Joe is so upset, he chops off his own thumbs in protest. In other words, nobody's going to make me work ever again. Bourne and Davidson have a falling out. Bourne, in writing, blames Davidson. He says, really, this is your fault. You promised him his freedom, right? This causes a schism between the two business partners that just keeps going into the Presbyterian church. Both of them were ordained ministers. In 1815, Bourne is elected by the locals to go to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. They call him up on stage. It's not clear whether he was planning to do this. I tend to think he probably wasn't. He was just talking off the cuff. He brings the question forward to the General Assembly, can one be a Christian and own slaves? Right? This had never been asked. Right? There had been several pamphlets by Quakers in the 18th century, but equating slave ownership with Christian sin had never been done before. This is a key moment in American history. This is so controversial, by the time he gets home, the churches have been barred against him. He goes on the circuit. He's going to go preach at Mossy Creek Church, and they've literally chained the door shut. He says in his letters, and his son recounts in the 1880s, he says, my father was constantly threatened with murder. People would just accost him on the street. This was so controversial. One of the letters, it says that while Bourne's wife is sick in bed upstairs, the good townspeople of Harrisonburg go into his house, remove all of his possessions, and burn them in the street. That's the only attestation of that I could find, but I think it probably did happen. Bourne is brought up on charges. One of the testimonies he gives against slavery implicates George Baxter's brother, John, who has been mistreating his slaves in a very bad manner. This is so hard of a testimony. Baxter charges George Bourne with libel. And they have a trial within the church on libel. The Hanover Presbytery finds George Bourne to be guilty, and they're about to disbar him. And then the General Assembly steps in from Philadelphia. They say, this isn't right. You need to void this. They voided that decision. Baxter brings up new charges, and it has nothing to do with his slavery the second time around, his stance on slavery. It's other things. He bought a horse on a Sunday. And he admits, yes, I did. I was going to preach in Winchester. My horse was lame. I couldn't get there on time. So I bought a horse on a Sunday. He brings the question back to the General Assembly in Philadelphia 3 years in a row. And finally, in 1818, they are moved to take a position against slavery. And this is only because of George Bourne being insistent. But then he gets run out of town permanently. When Baxter charges him again, he says to the General Assembly, he says, I can't go back to Virginia to defend myself. This is in 1819 now. I can't go back to Virginia to defend myself. They will lynch me. They will kill me. So one of the most important people who ever lived in our town got run out. And we've never talked about him since. He's not written about by John Wayland. Like, there is no local history book with this in it. He's been written out of our history. But he went on to be a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was president of that institution for a while. He was the editor of the Christian Emancipator, which was an abolitionist newspaper. He basically founded, after he left Virginia, he helped to found a revival movement that throughout the North and the West, it brought many, many people into the church, young people. Donald Matthews, a historian, says this was the ultimate millennial cause. In other words, if we can take on slavery as an issue, we're going to bring about God's kingdom on earth. When George died, he was eulogized by Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and some of the others, T.D. Weld, and he died at his desk working on slavery. I thought this was a very interesting testimony about George Bourne. This is by a man named John Matthews Nelson. I'll just read a little bit of it here. The first part is interesting to me because John Nelson is having a conscientious conversion experience. And this is what I think happened throughout Rockingham County on a very low level to different people, through the influence of people like George Bourne and through the influence of conscientious religious people. When I was quite a child, I recollect that it grieved me very much to see one tied up to be whipped, one being a slave. And I used to intercede with tears on their behalf and mingle my cries with theirs, feel almost willing to take part of the punishment. His father rebuked him for this, and then he gets a hardened heart where he becomes more than willing to do it himself until his father has to actually hold him back from killing his own slaves. Matthews writes about this many years later, decades later. The last time I saw my father, which was in the fall of 1832, he promised me that he would free all his slaves at his death. So this is the kind of conversation that's happening all through the 19th century in Virginia, local to us. These family debates about slavery. Dad, you can't have slaves. It's a sin. You won't go to heaven. Right? Well, I'll have to get rid of them when I die. And then through the influence of Reverend Dr. Speece, he changes his mind. Daddy changes his mind. But this John Nelson is so moved. He's talking here about the year 1809 or 10. I became a student of George Bourne. He was the first abolitionist I had ever seen, the first I had ever heard pray or plead for the oppressed, which gave me the first misgivings about the innocence of slaveholding. I received impressions from Mr. Bourne which I could not get rid of, and determined in my own mind that when I settled in life, it should be in a free state. This determination I carried to effect in 1813, and ever since then, he's becoming more of an abolitionist. This is the conscientious movement that's happening. It's an internal thing. It's not in the newspaper. It's in the human heart. And because of that, we have to treat it a little differently. There's no archaeology can't work on this problem, right? There's a lot of movement in the history sciences now where it's exactly that. It's a science. You can have ground penetrating radar settle a lot of questions about a lot of different things, including slavery. But you can't have ground penetrating radar do this. And this comes from David Bryan Davis. He calls it a type of moral dialectics. And then my professor, Bill Rogers, he uses the language of prophetic discourse. And what essentially happens is you have this cycle. So you have somebody says slavery is bad, right? Maybe slavery is bad. And then you have a reaction to that. Well, it is bad, but there's nothing we can do. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "We have the wolf by the ears. We can neither safely let it go nor hold on to it," which encapsulates, I think, a lot of the majority of people's opinions at that time. And of course you have, God can use slavery for good too. And then you have another cycle of the argument. And this is where Bourne comes in, most importantly. He does this very Calvinist thing where he says, your justification of this institution, this peculiar institution, is not about moral philosophy. It's you trying to justify making a profit without doing the labor, right? And that's a sin. He called it man-stealing. We'll see that a little bit later too. The title of man-stealer, he was quick to throw out on people, and people hated it. It was like the worst insult that as a slaveholder that you could have thrown at you. I didn't steal him. He was born in my possession. And then you have, again, another reaction. No, slaves on their own wouldn't be interested in freedom, right? They're not actually interested in freedom, except that you have these crazy abolitionists who show up and tell them that they should be free, right? If we didn't have those crazy abolitionists, the slaves would all be happy and good workers, and it's only because of them that we get these slave revolts. It's only because of them that they run away. They've been deceived, right? And oh, by the way, abolitionism is just another form of anarchy, right? So, again, Bourne, I just want to give you a sense of the language that Bourne would use. The corruption, this comes from his 1815 book. He wrote it in 1813. It wasn't published till 1815. And he didn't publish it himself. He had a press. He could have very easily published this himself. He had to go to Baltimore to get this published. And it took him 2 years to find somebody willing to publish it. Right? The corruption of the human heart and the deceitfulness which accompanies it are inconceivable. Among the various modes by which they are displayed, the detention of men in bondage indefinite should receive unmitigated execration. Will subsequent ages credit so monstrous a statement that preachers of the gospel, 1800 years after angels had sung on earth peace, goodwill to men, were characterized as proverbially devoted participants in all the enormities and iniquities of man-stealing? And nearly 40 years after the promulgation of the Columbian Declaration of Independence, reprobated its self-evident truths as unsound propositions, because in practice, their covetousness and their barbarous robbery of the rights of man would have been restrained. Again, so he's saying this isn't about moral dialectics or, Baxter's making these very eloquent philosophical arguments for slavery, Spies also. No, you just want to have slaves. So in 1818, Presbyterian Church of America basically comes to an agreement as a whole. We're against slavery. Oh, I missed something. I wanted to say also about Jefferson. They'll kill us all, right? Jefferson was so worried, if we free the slaves, they will rise up and murder us. And the Quaker publishers in Philadelphia, Benjamin Beach, he says, I think you've misunderstood the slave mentality. Slaves don't want to murder us. Maybe some of them do if you've really mistreated them. They just want their freedom. They want to be equal people. They just don't want to be mistreated. These are basically two very different concepts of human nature that are conflicting with each other. And then, of course, Spies, in the second grand movement of the dialectic, those who inflexibly taught slaves that their masters were robbers were guilty of a serious crime. And then you have the real fear, beyond the slaves will kill us all. Here's the second great fear. See if you can notice. We have one difficulty, however, to encounter on this subject, which did not exist in the old world, the distinction of color. But I have sometimes thought that this is not an insuperable difficulty, in France and England. Oh, I'm sorry, this text is cut off here. Maybe I can find it in my notes here. Okay, yes, and have intermixed but very little with the orders of society above them. The best prospect has been afforded on this subject by the Colonization Society, is what he says. The only way out of this predicament is send them back to Africa. That was a very popular opinion to have. People of every political stripe. In fact, George Bourne himself, for many years, was a proponent of this. The person who convinced him not to be was Frederick Douglass. And he says, I have very little to do with Africa except the color of my skin. My family, my people are here now. It's too late for going back, kind of thing. So I'm sorry, this was Spies in 1819. He has to put down a position on paper for the Presbyterian Church that upholds the decision that they had made in 1818 against slavery, but still gives some wiggle room that we don't have to get rid of our slaves right away, right? The Methodists had something very similar happen. Asbury says in like 1807 or something, he says, this is wrong. We'll never have, the Methodist clergy will never have slaves. We might be able to tolerate the members of the churches having slaves, but definitely not the clergy. Well, by 1840, it's not even open question anymore. It's all the Southern Methodist preachers had slaves. It was this retrograde movement. It happened in every denomination, including the Mennonites. The Mennonites, we like to think of as, buttons. The Mennonites would kick their members out if they got slaves, or they would leave on their own because they wanted slaves, but there was no preventing them from actually getting slaves. So Baxter revisits this. You have this retrograde thing happening where we now have to retroactively justify slavery because we've been called sinners for having slaves. And in Baxter's case, this was personal. As I said, one of the first things he does against Bourne is bring a charge of libel against him. Right? Some persons opposed to abolition principles are unwilling to insist that the relation of master is lawful. This was a whole debate. Is the relation of master and slave a lawful, biblically lawful relationship? They have these big debates about this. My part, I do not believe that the system of slavery will or can be perpetual in this country. Certain principles are lodged in the very structure of every society, which under the influence of Christianity will abolish slavery as soon as a slave is prepared for freedom. So in Baxter's opinion, we can free the slaves, but not right now. They're not ready, right? And who's to say when they're ready? The guy with the Doctor of Divinity, right? And the slaves of his own, right? Carl likes that one. Yeah. Carl's a preacher. Yes, we will use Christianity. How will we use it? Well, we won't call slavery a sin, but we'll use Christianity to get rid of slavery. Right. And here's another section of the same treatise that he wrote in 38. Is on the account of the danger of slave uprising that I have attempted to rectify the mistakes of the abolition system. I can see no cure for the evil impending, but to take the ground which the scriptures evidently warrant, that the relations of slavery are lawful, whilst they are necessary. That was his caveat. They're necessary. We didn't pick slavery. Our ancestors did, but, we're stuck with it now, right? So while they're necessary, it's still a lawful system. And then, by the way, we have this other duty to the slaves to Christianize them, whether they like it or not. The principles of abolition cannot be reconciled with the principles of the gospel. Again, abolition is now the problem, not slavery. They are evidently two sets of principles which must come from systems diametrically opposite to one another. And then the loose manner in which ultramen, that's the far lefties, are treating the scriptures in the present day, making them signify anything or nothing as suits their purpose, is well calculated to unsettle the public mind, prepare our country for receiving the dogmas of popery. This is a Catholic conspiracy, abolition, even though the Catholic Church was not against slavery. So basically, there's two different ideas of human nature that are conflicting with each other. And Baxter and Bourne were roughly contemporaries. There were very few educated men or women in the Virginia backcountry, which this still was, if you could find another person who had been in a seminary, even if they didn't graduate, like, you're doing pretty good, they're two peas in a pod. And good friends. They would preach together. They would ordain people together. Yet they just couldn't even get along. Why? They had these two very different ideas of human nature. And one of the cool things that I found, nobody knows this exists. There's only one copy that I'm aware of anywhere in the world, is Bourne's Treatise on Education that he wrote while he was at Fort Defiance. And it's the only copy that I've seen is in Worcester, Massachusetts, in the American Antiquarian Society vault. And it's a fascinating text. In 1809, he's still using this language of, he uses the word Kafaria to denote non-white peoples. And he's saying, there's nothing implicitly wrong with those people. They're human beings. They're equal to us in all but the comforts of civilized life, which we possess, flow not from any difference of conformation, but solely from instruction. And this, with every rational creature and every philanthropist, is a sufficient recommendation of the gospel. Education, training, nature versus nurture, right? This would center nurture more than nature, right? Bourne's philosophy is just slightly different than Baxter's. This was an interesting quote. If the Southern slaves were emancipated in a body, placed in a community by themselves, they would sink into a savage state, live by the chase or the spontaneous production of the earth, or else they would establish new forms of slavery amongst themselves. I believe it to be a fact that all the sufferings of mankind proceed from one uniform source, that is the depravity or moral corruption of our nature. There is no greater evil than to give the multitude a degree of liberty which they are unprepared to enjoy. Again, if you're for abolition, you're against civil government. I wonder what he would have thought if he had seen Abraham Lincoln in office using troops to put down his countrymen. The moral corruption of man is the case which makes them both necessary. So this is a more Calvinist approach, maybe. And this brings up another very interesting point. I'll come back to that. Actually, two very interesting points. The difference between immediatism and gradualism. I did a very thorough survey of all the literature of abolition over a course of a couple of years. And there's only one or two places where I found this made explicit. And one just happened to be in my advisor's PhD dissertation, where he talks about this difference. Carl gets it, yes. Thank you, Bill, by the way, for this. When Bourne was asked, what do you want to do with slavery? He would say, I want to take a step immediately. Not everybody should be free right now. In fact, towards the end of his life, he says, it may take us 1,000 years to get rid of slavery. It ends up being about 50 from the time he took his first stance. In fact, 1815 to 1865 is 50 years. Right? He didn't live to see the end of it. He says, it may take us 1,000 years as a society if we start today. But that was the key difference. He wanted to start today. The others did not. So gradualism would have argued, we'll start soon. Lloyd Garrison and Bourne and Frederick Douglass were against that, but not in the way that they were made out to be. So here's an interesting thought from David Bryan Davis. If you don't want to read this, that's fine. This is just basically the moral dialectic, the movement of the Southern rationale for slavery, right? Southern culture, Davis argues, was actually very pluralized and had a very strong hybridity to it. such that it could afford to have very hard debates. Of course, there were limits to that debate, as George Bourne found out. But eventually what you have is this channeled idealism. So in the North, young people are very idealistic. They can go to the revival meeting and hear abolitionist preaching. In the South, by 1830, it's illegal to say things that are abolitionist. By law, you cannot say those things, right? John Hersey, by the way, comes back from Africa, the Methodist preacher that founded Methodism in Africa. He comes back and he has a book with him, and it's just literally word for word the debates in the State House about slavery, just summarized and written down in a book, both sides. And he's in Fredericksburg. The state militia catches him with these books in his bag, burns the books, and is going to lynch him, and he has to be saved by a friend of his. It was illegal to, it wasn't always, it got to be illegal, so that by 1850 you have these lynchings. This lynching in Port Republic is one of them. Jefferson Randall was the man's name. He, among other things, he was a lowlife, a ne'er-do-well, but he was talking to Negroes that were not his own, and that got him lynched. That's a very interesting chapter. Yeah, you can read that. Again, one of the interesting things that I found is, that's going to be included in the book, is the notes to the Board of Managers of the Rockingham Colonization Society. Rockingham County had one of the most active colonization groups. They would have meetings regularly. They would have concerts and preachings and editorials in the newspaper, fundraisers, and they would send a lot of freed Black people back to Africa. And in their minds, it was back. That got to be very big, and it was a mixed bag. Some people were doing it as what's called a Herrenvolk racial purity project. Some people were doing it as a legitimate way of trying to solve the slavery problem without being abolitionist. You really didn't have a lot of options if you were against slavery. Again, you have this hardening of heart. That's the simple way I could put it. And that's a phrase that David Bryan Davis uses. I didn't invent that. Starting from about 1790 till about 1861, you have this building anger and resentment among Southern white people. Some of it was misplaced class resentment. So in other words, if I am poor and I hate those rich people over there and I want to get back at them, all I have to do is wait till there's a rumor of a slave revolt. I can go kill some of their slaves and get away with it, and that hurts them financially. Right? That's misplaced class. The other interesting thing, though, that still gets me is that George Bourne has been written out of our history. We have a Martin Luther King Jr. Road, Boulevard, thank you. We have a Gandhi Center at James Madison University. I don't know if you know this, Martin Luther King says many times over, I was inspired by Gandhi. Gandhi writes to Martin Luther King, he says, I was inspired by Tolstoy. You can read the letters from Tolstoy to Gandhi, where Tolstoy says, I was inspired by the abolitionists. Right? So you have this circle back. The first Christian abolitionist message in America started in Harrisonburg, and they kicked them out violently. Now we have a Gandhi Center and a Martin Luther King Boulevard, and we don't even remember the first part of that cycle. And then, for example, Bourne's testimony against slavery, he wrote a 10-page letter where he details locally all of the abuses of slaves that he witnessed or that he heard about while he lived here for 8 years. And this gets quoted and requoted in almost every text on the matter. The last one was by a guy I really respect at Shenandoah University. He uses word for word Bourne's testimony against slavery, but he never names Bourne. Why? I don't know. Here's an interesting, so when in the 1830s, Bourne reprinted some of his anti-slavery writings, and he had an illustrator put on paper these images that he remembered from his time in Virginia. So it's not organic to Rockingham County, but it should be. This is a scene that George Bourne would have witnessed. Slavers flogging women. And you can see it's not flogging a Negro, or it's not flogging a slave woman, it's an American woman. So they're very conscious about their language by 1830s. So here's where we can end. I'm happy to take questions, by the way. Here's another thing. So there are a couple of books about George Bourne. The one was his son's very short book, like booklet, maybe 30 pages, about his father, and he published that in the 1880s. The next one is in 1969. So like 80 years later, there's a treatment of Bourne by some guys in Delaware. And then finally in 2020, a guy in China named Ryan McElhaney wrote a book about George Bourne, about specifically about his theology. One of the interesting things he says, Ryan McElhaney says from China about George Bourne is, he has this very deep Reformation spirit. He goes through all of these Reformation figures, Calvin, Erasmus, these different people who might have been influential on George Bourne's writing. And he says, I just can't really place it. He was like a Reformation person, but he was more radical. So with the Anabaptist historians in the room, I could say, roll my eyes and say, anybody who's lived in Rockingham County for any amount of time can tell you where the radical Reformation influence on George Bourne came from. All these Anabaptists that live here, right? So that's one of the cool things about doing local history. I want to emphasize this, especially in a place like Rockingham County, which is on the borderland. This was the borderland during the Civil War of North and South. It changed hands numerous times. It still is kind of on the borderland in many ways. You have this Pennsylvania Dutch influence. We were more culturally associated here with Philadelphia and Baltimore than we were with Richmond. But in English literature, they call this an ecotone. It's a borderland where things mix differently. And I want to suggest that American anti-slavery, as we know it, the thing that eventually became the abolition movement, and that by 1865 had resulted in the end of slavery, started in Rockingham County in the middle Shenandoah Valley as a result of this mix of theologies and personal philosophies and conscientious feelings that were floating around here. This is, again, why you can't just do science in history. You have to read letters. You have to know some philosophy. Boo. There's a moral irreducibility to this, right? So you can't just say slavery is bad. We all know slavery is bad. Very few people, even in 1819, would say slavery is good, right? It's in the complexity that you have to really get into the weeds of this to understand what happened and why things are the way they are. And a lot of that is this moralistic revisionism. I don't want to get into the whole debate about slavery in the Shenandoah versus slavery elsewhere, but recently there was a book published through JMU that says that there's this recently debunked myth that slavery didn't exist in the Valley. Oh, really? This was last year this book was published. Wow. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that slavery didn't exist in the Valley, right? And yet that's in this book. And I wrote a whole chapter on tracking down where that myth came from. And my conclusion was that it was a type of moralistic revisionism. And you can read the book if you're interested in that. Yeah, I want to close with this thought. This was from one of Bourne's letters to Andrew Davidson. He's writing this book that became a bestseller that really kick-started the Christian movement for liberation in America and inspired Tolstoy and Gandhi and Martin Luther King indirectly. And he did that in Harrisonburg. I have a volume nearly ready for the press, which I expect will satisfy every man who wishes to know the truth of the impracticability of reconciling slavery and the gospel, but which I suppose I scarcely dare publish. So that's the end. You can read the book when it comes out, if you're interested. Are there any questions? Elwood.
Evan, back a ways, thanks. You mentioned you had Baxter and Bourne on the same slide, and you mentioned the words nurture and versus nature. Which were you putting with which?
George Bourne was more of, I would say, on the nurture side of that dialectic.
I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly.
Yeah, and it's, I would say that Baxter's way of looking at anti-slavery was more essentialized. It thought of black people in a kind of reduced way, whereas George Bourne would say that black people and white people aren't really that different. Really, the main difference is their education, their socialization.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk also without the mic.
It's for the online.
Sorry, it's for the online people. Yeah. Which churches would have been the mainstream churches? I guess that's my first question.
Yes. So in Virginia, the mainstream church has always been the Anglican church.
And here in the Valley?
In the Valley?
Or where the areas you're talking about right here?
Yes, the first churches were Quaker, Presbyterian, and Anabaptist.
So those really are the main churches here. Okay, so
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now I was thinking somehow, because I've heard always.
Oh, I'm sorry, and Methodist. I forgot to. Okay, yes. Lutheran Reformed, yes. And maybe Swiss Reform a little bit.
Did some of those hold to the apologist Southern belief that God ordained, that blacks would be on the low end and should be nurtured and cared for and work for the superior races?
Yeah, surprisingly, that wasn't a big idea yet. That's part of the backflow, the moral dialectic, the backside of that dialectic that comes back. Surprisingly, this area has always had a very progressive feel to those kind of questions. I didn't see much of that kind of racist, overtly racist. The only kind of racist things that I found in this area were those very subtle things, like the one we saw of Conrad Spies, where he's kind of just throwing that out there a little bit. It was never like white supremacy all the way down. That happened by maybe in the 1850s. So I know Elwood looked surprised when I said that, but it surprised me. So
Theology question.
okay.
So we talked about the kind of the biblical or the theological basis of developing a moral ethic towards slavery. How much did Paul's letter to Philemon
Yes.
play
All the
in these
time.
conversations?
Yes. Every single one. Bourne is really challenged by the letter to Philemon. How are you saying it? Philemon? I've heard it different ways. Bourne is really challenged by that letter. He goes to great lengths. I think he has a whole chapter on that, just that text. It's a short letter, and it's the Apostle Paul, and he's saying, he's telling a slave in the first century basically to go back to your master in a very different context. But yes, that gets used in almost every debate. That's the first thing that comes up. Yeah, there's some other like ancillary texts to that get used too. But quickly, Bourne gets into the Greek. He was a master theologian, in my opinion. He gets down into the weeds of the Greek text. He's very good at that. In some ways, he had the perfect calling as a preacher. And when that job ended for him, I think he lost something, but the world lost something. But he was so theologically, he had such a minute understanding of everything theological that you could tell he was definitely seminary trained. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Someone online would like to know if the arguments by Bourne et al. For the continuation of slavery used any justification from the Bible, such as Noah cursing his grandson and saying that his grandson would be a servant to his first son.
Yes. Yes. I actually have a horse in that. I have some skin in that fight. 9 generations back, my grandfather, Philip Knappenberger, so my great-great-great-great-grandfather, wrote a biblical defense of slavery. And I think that's one of the things he uses. But yeah, there were a lot of biblical justifications, but there were also these little snippets. Again, Bourne's favorite was the man-stealer. I forget exactly, I have it in my notes, what text that comes from in the Bible, but I think it's Paul, and he's condemning man-stealing as one of the worst sins in one of those sin lists that he made. Yes, there were some very knockdown, drag-out fights over those kind of theological issues. Yeah. Thank you.
The gradualism was repeated in the integration movement.
Yes.
It was a big argument,
Yes.
how gradually we have to do this. You
Yep.
can tell by my accent where I'm from.
That's a very interesting point. Yes.
Let's see, did I understand you correctly? Did you say that there were Mennonites here in this area who owned slaves, who would have been members of the Mennonite church?
Let me put it differently. There were Mennonites, people who left the Mennonite church who owned slaves, or who were made to leave once they got slaves. The big example that always gets used is the Kaufman family, C-O-F-F, Kaufman family at Mannheim. You know, they still have the slave quarters, or they did until recently, if you know where that is. Nancy Sorrells and Suzanne Simmons make a big point about this. They have several essays that they wrote about how the Mennonites were complicit in slave ownership in the valley. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
go
my
ahead.
understanding is that the Mennonites here in the area had a church policy that they would not be in favor of exchanging labor with
Yes.
slaveholders. But if the slaveholder sent his slave as a person to help on the Mennonites' farm, they could accept that, but they would have been definitely opposed to slavery.
Yeah, Elwood could probably answer that question better. But yeah, I think
We'll save it for a future talk.
Stephanie.
Hi, I had two kind of simple questions. So the first one is this press in Harrisonburg that Bourne was a partner in and that was using enslaved labor. Were they printing abolitionist literature, what we would call abolitionist sentiments?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's something I didn't know if I'd have time to cover, so I kind of opted not to. But no, they really didn't print any abolitionist stuff there. Like I said, Bourne he wrote his seminal text, Slavery and the Book Irreconcilable was his seminal text. He wrote that in 1813, and he didn't want to print it here. The nearest publisher he could find was in Baltimore, and it took him 2 years to find one. But the press part of this story is also very interesting. Who knows about Ananias Davison? Anybody? A couple people. The singers. So Ananias was, I forget how he was related exactly. I think they were cousins. Ananias Davison was a cousin to Andrew Baker Davidson, who was Bourne's business partner and co-preacher while he was in Harrisonburg. This is the guy who owned Uncle Joe, who lost his thumbs. The cousin worked for them also, and apprenticed in printing, became a very famous printer in his own right, who printed the the Kentucky Harmony, thank you, and became like a world famous, his hymns are still used. Another person that got involved by 1815 was Lawrence Wortman, if that name rings any bells. Wortman started the Rockingham Register, which then became the DNR. We all know the Daily News Record. And I think that was in about 1818, although the earliest kind of extant records we have are like 1828 maybe. We have a couple copies from the 1820s. But the Funks also apprenticed at that same press a little bit later. So all of the local printing, all of the local literature goes back to George Bourne and Andrew Baker Davidson. There's another cool thing I should mention too, while I'm on these kind of weird tangents. A lot of the history of Texas and Kentucky are wrapped up with this story too. These Presbyterians, Andrew Baker was cousin to a guy named Daniel Baker, who was like the first Presbyterian minister in Texas. Sam Houston was part of this community. The Ewings, the Boones, Daniel Boone. All those people had roots in Rockingham County. Often you have, like, on Linville Creek, like we had the Baxter House. The Lincolns were right there. Daniel Boone's, I think his grandfather, his uncle lived there. A guy named Daniel Bryan lived there. He became a famous author and state senator, and a hardcore abolitionist also. There were some very interesting things going on. Those people, their politics didn't match up with our politics today. So they weren't just conservative and liberal. They would like be religiously conservative and socially liberal. I don't know, it's hard to explain. But yeah, they didn't print any of the abolitionist stuff here. I don't think they ever did. But by the 1850s, Wortman is a fire breather, they called them, a hardcore Confederate. And he actually uses the term abolitionists, the abolitionist army, for the Union troops, which I don't think very many of the Union troops were probably abolitionists at all. But like that was his propaganda that he was pumping out from that press in the 1860s. That's like a regular smear for him. Go ahead, Steph.
Yeah, and then one other question is, did you find that Bourne was forgotten all over the U.S. or mostly just here in Rockingham County especially?
All over. The people who have remembered Bourne are very specialized. So like Ryan McElhaney, like I said, he lives in China. I don't think he's even been to Virginia. And he's kind of the expert on George Bourne that's living. Again, there's very few people that were interested in Bourne, professionally or personally. Yeah, is that it?
Did you finish your sentence?
I can talk a long time.
Yes. Well, if you know Evan, you know
Yeah,
he is
just
a
pull me
font of fascinating details and
Thank you.
interesting
This was
history.
great. I'm glad you all
Thank
came.
you. Thank you. If you want to hear more from Evan, you can come on Thursday mornings to visit the museum, and he's usually here volunteering. And I'm sure that he'd be happy to talk to you for a few minutes as everybody's departing. I just want to say thank you again for coming, and I hope we see you next month. Nadia Damas will be talking about her family, and the Muslim community that has grown here in Harrisonburg and Rockingham. So the roots of that community. So lots of things to talk about and think about. And I wish you a great week. Hope to see you next Thursday at the Heirloom Markets.